All right, let's talk multi-brand design systems because this is a Coke product and this is also a Coke product. And so is that. So how would I set up my design system to support all of these? We're going to look at the different approaches to multi-brand design system setup. We're going to look at different strategies and just cover a lot of the logistics associated with it. And of course, answer a lot of the questions that you had from my first YouTube video on this about a year and a half ago. Let's get started. And if you're a big fan of what the team and I are doing at UI Collective, be sure to check out UI Collective Academy. Or right now, you get access to premium courses, a bunch of different micro lessons, a bunch of different perks like our collective kit design system, a private Slack community, weekly office hours, and so much more. The team and I were just going to keep adding on to it, adding more courses, micro lessons, perks, downloads. Big shout out to everyone who's already supported thus far with a lot more on the way. Hope to see you on there. Even if you sign up for UI Collective normally, you can still get access to exclusive downloads, member-only savings, and also community support where you just have a quick question. You can come ask the team or the community a question on our forum. All right, what's going on? So what we're going to look at today is multi-brand design systems, setup, approaches, nuances, things that drive me crazy when doing it, so on and so forth. Okay. So about a year and a half ago, I filmed a video on this. I've been getting a lot of questions since, and it's been a pretty popular video lately. So I'm going to refilm it, cover a lot of things that I covered in that one, and also some new things as well. Okay. So let's dive right in. Now, disclaimer. Every brand is different. There are no two brands or two in this world that are exactly the same. So your brand might have unique differences, which might favor one approach over the other, or combine the two approaches, or even like a third approach to generate ultimately a design system that works for your set of brands. Okay. Every brand is different. With multi-brand design systems, it's not as straightforward as if X, then do Y. If Y, then do X. It's more like if X, then do Y plus a little bit of Z. Okay, that's really where we're going with things. This can be a very confusing topic. Now, if you are here because you've never built a design system before, this is probably not the right video for you. I would go watch our Build a Design System series or also our design system setup video. Again, links for those will be down below. So that said, when it comes to multi-brand design system and the different types of approaches, it's up to you to make the determination. As I said, if X, it's not as simple as if X, then do Y. And I'll get a lot of emails around basically like detailing every aspect of a design system, screenshots, the whole bit, and basically asking me if I can pick and choose which approach that they should take. But I don't know the finer details of every element of that brand, right? So you as an expert, it's up to you to make the determination, combine approaches, introduce a new approach maybe that is going to work for your set of brands. So today, we're going to look at two different approaches. A branded house, which is perfect for brands that share a similar color. So think like Coca-Cola, Diet Coke, Coke Zero. And we're also going to look at a house of brands approach, which is perfect for brands that share different colors entirely. So think like Coca-Cola, Fanta, Sprite, so on and so forth. Okay, so these are the two primary approaches that we've come up with and we sort of talk about when we're working with our enterprise design system clients. But again, there is no right answer. So with that said, let's start with the branded house approach because it's a little bit easier to understand. So branded house, what a branded house is basically if all the brands within that company share roughly the same colors, but just with some minor iterations between them. Okay, now a great example of this is Coke. Okay, not the Coca-Cola company, because we're going to look at that a little bit later on, but Coca-Cola as like a product brand. Okay, because, and now I know one thing, like one thing here is in your country, you might not have Diet Coke or you might not have Coke Zero, you might just have Coke. But here in Canada, at least, we have like all three plus like a bunch of other different types of Coke, which is why I'm using this as an example. So apologies if you don't have Diet Coke. Anyways, let's continue. Is if we look about Coca-Cola, okay, what's one thing that we noticed here is that their primary color is red. So what we're going to do, let's just build out a simple button here. Call this learn more. Sorry, we're going to make this way bigger, like 48 so you can see it. Learn more, add some auto layouts, like 48 by 48. Again, huge button, but just for the purpose of this exercise, their color might be this red and the text is going to be like that white. Okay, so let's call this button. And then let's create the component of this. And let's add some more. Now, still the same, moving on, we're also going to have Diet Coke. Diet Coke as well is going to have, likely, what's one thing that we notice here? A gray button. With me so far? Perfect. And also, too, one thing that we might notice here is that their Text color is a little bit different here, where it's a little bit more black, so we can make that a little bit more darker, okay? Again, be careful with accessibility purposes of this demo, whatever. Then we move on to Coke Zero. What's one thing that we notice is their color might be dark and their text color might be red. Again, just as an example, I don't actually know. That red looks a little harsh. Let's make it white, okay? So one thing that we notice here as well, so their main colors are a little bit different, but the branding is really exactly the same because the font styles are relatively the same. They probably have, like, if we look at the cans here, they still have like that line across the cans for Diet Coke, Coke Zero. I assume it's the same with Coke Classic as well. So it looks as if the entire brand is relatively the same. Not much changes between font, not much changes between the majority of their colors. There's really only subtle variations between the brands within that brand itself. This is what we call a branded house, where within the house, you sort of have similar brands. You all live and exist sort of almost as one, okay? This is the easiest approach to take if you really only have minor differences between those brands themselves. So a great example of this is actually if you go onto Coca-Cola's website, where they have like Coke Original, Coke Zero, and Diet Coke. Okay, let's just toggle between them. So here we are just on like the Coca-Cola page itself. Okay, so basic Coke brand. One thing we're gonna do, let's toggle between the Coca-Cola Zero Sugar. Boom. Well, what's one thing that we notice? Most things stay the same. It's just some of the core colors that are a little bit different. So if I toggle between Coca-Cola Original and Coke Zero Sugar, I want you to watch that button, okay? Look what happens. Just the surface color changes. Same with this background too. It changes to black, okay? Then if we toggle to Diet Coke, in this case, the button actually stays the same, so it stays black, but the background then switches to gray. So notice how basically almost everything stays exactly the same. It's just some of those core colors that are a little bit different. Now, this is a great example of a branded house. Everything really stays the same. You don't need to worry about changing modules. You don't need to worry about changing of visual appearances of buttons, components, tabs between brands. What it is just the colors that are really changing. Okay, so now that we have a pretty good fundamental understanding as to a branded house, let's now look at actually setting this up. So we're going to look at nuances associated with the setup and answer some of your questions that you probably have in like just a sec. But one thing that's really important for me to do, okay, is to call out the different collection types. So because again, this really serves as the foundation for setting up a really good multi-brand design system. And having 3 collections, again, we've worked with hundreds of enterprise clients in building their design system, dozens if not, okay? So a lot of designers will take a 2-tiered approach. They use a primitive collection and a semantic collection. But then when they do that, they come running and say, all of a sudden, my design system doesn't work with multi-brands because all of a sudden I only have 2 collections and there's just nuance associated with that. Anyways, I digress. So if you are using a multi-brand design system, I strongly recommend to use a 3-tiered approach to your design token architecture. This is using a brand collection, an alias collection, and also a mapped collection. You're going to see why. So starting off with your brand collection, this is kind of like your primitive collection if you're using a 2-tiered approach. What this is just your hex codes and really in their purest form. These are your purples, these are your reds, these are your greens. You're not assigning them a role yet, okay? It's just what are all the base color scales associated with your brands, okay? And again, I say brands because this is a branded house approach because all the colors that those brands are going to share are ultimately going to be set in the brand collection or what you might know as like a global collection, okay? So if I was to go into my variables here and create a color, and we're just going to call this collection brand. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to delete that second collection. Let's delete that. Let's rename and just call this something like brand. This would be like our red grouping. So like our red 100, we'd have all our reds in here, like 200, 300, so on and so forth. I could duplicate this group for like our greens, and I could duplicate this group for like our grays, so on and so forth. Okay, so we're not giving them a specific role yet. It's just all of those hex codes in their purest form. Anyways, I digress. Then let's look at our alias collection. So our alias collection is now actually where we start to define what these scales are for. Okay, so in the case of our purple, maybe this here is our primary. Okay, in the case of our red, maybe this is like an error. In the case of our green, maybe this is a success. So what does that look like? So let's create a new collection here that we're just going to call alias. And now we're giving these individual scales its purpose. Okay. And again, I'm going to elaborate this more in depth as we continue through the tutorial. So our primary, 100. Okay. In this case, then what we do is we would, let's create the alias of that. And we would connect that back to, I don't know, if it's Coca-Cola, like our red. Okay. Duplicate this. We would have our error. And we might also connect to our red. Okay. And we duplicate this. And we're going to have our success, where we would connect back to a green. Okay, so we're still not applying the individual variables here yet. We're not applying the individual variables in our alias collection to our components. That comes in the mapped collection, but the alias collection is what really serves the foundation for your second, third, fourth, fifth brands in the branded house approach. We'll elaborate that a little bit later on. And then lastly, in our mapped collection here, this is ultimately where we are, one, having our light and dark mode, because each brand is going to need a light and dark mode, but we're also giving the individual variables a name that's going to be applied to our components. So your border colors, your error colors, your text colors, so on and so forth. This is the 3-tiered approach to design token architecture at a really high level. As we go through and look at adding additional brands, I'm going to talk more in depth about each collection, okay? But before I did that, I wanted to give you a brief intro if you've never seen this approach before. So without further ado, let's talk about actually building out scales and some of the nuances associated if two of your brands are really, really similar in terms of that primary color. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at like building out our multi-brand design system now, okay? One thing we're not going to do is we're not going to build out an entire variable library, okay? If you're all watching this video, my assumption is that you actually already have a design system. You don't want to build it from scratch, okay? If you do want to build it from scratch, go watch our design system setup video where I cover that more in depth, but we're going to take a much more simplified approach to this in this video. We're going to look at a couple different scales and look at our text and small things like that too, okay? So one thing we're going to start off with, and what I have here are just screenshots from the Coca-Cola website, okay, just to give ourselves a little bit of a visual here, okay? So we're going to cover how I set up one scale, because again, a scale is a great foundation for a great multi-brand design system. So apologies if you've been here for a while, you already see how you make scales. Anyways, sorry. But then what we're going to do is we're going to look at scales for brands that are like kind of similar and answer some of the questions that I get along the way, okay? So let's start with that scale now that that preamble's over. Okay, so real quick, to get a nice, crisp, clean color scale, what I do is, again, I just set this background to white, okay? And I sort of have other shades here that have the background set to dark. So one thing we can do here, I was going to add one more layer as well, again, just for a visual, or maybe we won't, anyways, whatever, is going lighter, I set the opacity down at like 20% intervals to start. You can do 10%, you can do 15%, doesn't really matter. This would be like 60, this would be like 40, this would be 40, this would be 20. And then this here, if we wanted one in between, this would be like a 10%, okay? And then going up, we do the same thing. But because these are on a black background, notice how it gets darker and not lighter. So I know what you're probably thinking is, Kirk, we can't have opacity in our scales. Yeah, you're right, you're not wrong. So this is 80, 60, 40. Let's go with like a 20%, and let's go with like a 10%, okay? Then what I do is I take these, just like reposition it right beside. So we have sort of our core red here. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to color match. So here, take this, color match, and then we pull sort of that raw color without the opacity. And then this is ultimately going to serve as the scale that we're going to use. Again, we're only going to do this once, just in case you do need to go back and correct some of your color scales. There we go. Beautiful. So now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and add this to our brand collection under our red. Okay, so now if this is a new concept for you, pay close attention here, because anything that's like the bulk of my scales here went up with a 20% interval. So these are actually going to be sort of my 100 value. If it ends in like if it's a 100, 200, 300, 400, so on and so forth, it's going to be that 20% interval. If you went up by 10% intervals each time, then what you can do is like each of those 10% intervals will be that clean 100 number, 100, 200, 300, 400. Okay. But you're going to notice at the top and also at the bottom here, I only went up by 10%. So what those are going to be, those are actually going to be a 50, and this is going to be a 100. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, sorry. So what we can do now is just copy the hex codes here. So we have this one, we have this one, which is our 300, this one here, which is our 400, 400. This one here is our core colors. This is our 500. There we go. And then we're going to go with our 600, 700, 800, 900, 600. So I'll extend this. 700, 800, 900, and then we have our 950. So sorry, I moved this out. So sorry, collapse this in. Running out of space here. I need a bigger laptop. Oops, come on, what happened there? Okay, so there we're going to have our 600. We're going to have our 700. We're going to have our 800. We're going to have our 900. And then we're going to have our 950 again, because it went up by only 10% in terms of that opacity. So one thing that confuses a lot of designers when they're building a multi-brand design system is in their brand collection, is they're already familiar with the idea. Again, we've been teaching this concept on YouTube for like 2.5 years now, something like that. And this is where like a lot of other creators who don't live and breathe design systems like we do, is like we do this as our day job. All we do is build design systems, is where they tend to lead folks astray. Well, they'll watch some of our other videos, turn to like put it in like sort of their own words and add their own twist, but they're not thinking about some of the minor nuance associated with it. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just here to help. Okay. So one thing I've done here is I've taken the liberty, so you didn't have to watch me do it, of doing the same thing that we did for our Diet Coke color as we did with our regular Coke color. And so many designers, the question I get all the time is, oh, but I need different scales for my colors in the brand collection. Okay. Now, pay close attention to this, is because this color here is like a really, really faint gray. Okay. Or really like it's a light gray. And then our Coke, what is it? Zero sugar. Its main color is like basically black. Now, if we were to go through and actually build out a scale here, okay, so if this is at 10%, and let's set this maybe to something even tighter, like 5%. Okay, let's bring out a shade here and just color match. Okay, these two colors are basically identical. They are basically the same. Like you cannot look at these and be like, oh, that's not black. You're looking at it and say, oh, it's black. Like, come on, look at the color scale. Like, look at the hex code. Sorry, they're basically the same. And where multi-brand design systems, from a branded house approach, where designers always tend to get stuck, is they think that they're going to need different scales for their brands inside the brand collection. Okay, at least from this branded house approach. So what a lot of designers are going to do is they're going to be like gray brand one, and they're going to duplicate this and be like gray brand 2, when realistically these colors are literally exactly the same. There is no difference between them. So if you're like working within a branded house approach, it's totally fine just to combine them into one scale. So if we take this forward here, and let's just color match here. So same things. Let's go with a 100 or sorry, this is going to be sorry, video cut out on me. So this might actually be, so we're going to have like a 50, 100. Again, this is color match all the way down. There we go. 50, 100. There we go. 200. Let's go with our 300. 50, 100, 200, 300. Let's go with our 400. Oops, sorry. Wrong one. 400. Then we'll go with our 500, 600, 700, 800. Sorry, I know this is tedious to watch me do it, but we're just going to do a couple of these together just so you fully understand. 700. Then we're going to go with our 800, 500, 600, 700, 800. Then we go with our 850, I believe. 850, and then also we're 875 then, okay? Because we only went up by, increased it by that 10.5% margin. Then this here would be that 875, whatever it is. Okay, so there we go. There we have that scale set up. Hopefully I didn't mess up anywhere. Now let's elaborate on sort of what I was chatting about before. So because our black is so similar to our darkest color, okay, we're not going to need a different scale for like gray brand 2. Like it just doesn't make sense. Okay, we're going to separate out between brands and actually the Alias collection. So what we can really do here, just at the end, is call this black. Okay, and just set that to black. And one thing we can also do here is set this to white. And if we move this up, there we go. We can just set that to white. Okay, it's an easy way of doing it. Alternatively, one thing that you can do is also just create like a new group here and just call this foundations. Okay, I've been doing this a little bit more lately, which is like black. And then if I duplicate this, and then this was to be white, and then there you have sort of your black and white variables. Now, that's more of a complex way of looking at it, but picture if like brand A was this color here, and then brand B was this color here. So they actually do share like the exact same scale. Question I get all the time, Kirk, what should I do with my scales? Okay, if your brand colors are in the exact same scale or super similar, like you don't need to separate out scales for your different brands in your brand collection. Okay, like you can keep them general. We're going to separate the colors out a little bit later on. So really, please do not do that. Do not overcomplicate it. You can simplify it. Now, still in the concept of branded house, question I get all the time is, Kirk, what do I do if my success colors are like green brand 1, like my greens are different between the brands, brand 2. And then let's say you have like your air colors are also different between the brands. You might have red brand 1 and then like red brand 2. Okay. Now with this, all of a sudden you're getting into branded house territory, which we're going to look at, or house of brands territory, sorry, that we're going to look at a little bit later on. The approach that we're going over right now is if there are only fundamental differences between the primary colors. Every other color is going to stay the same. So in this case, all 3 of our brands are going to share the same green for all of those success states. Where there are differences are in the primary colors. All 3 of these brands are going to share the same air states, okay, that are going to tie back to that red color itself, okay? If you start breaking up the different scales here to accommodate for different brands, you are no longer in a branded house. You are in a house of brands. Again, that we're going to look at a little bit later on, but thought I'd call it out here while I have you. Okay, so in honor of being Canadian, I've decided to put on my flannel. Ooh. Okay. One thing too that I've just done here real quick. Again, I'm doing this making the assumption that you already have, like if you're watching this video, you already have your design system. Is I just added scales for blue and also for orange. So what these are going to represent are our information and also our warning colors. We already have our green, which is going to be our success. We already have our red, which is going to be our air. And again, our core brand colors in this case are going to come from gray, and they're also going to come from red. Okay, so these are sort of the standard colors that we like to see in our design system. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move into our Alias collection and talk about some different strategies there, and also look at where we're going to apply some of those different brands as well. Okay, so now let's go into our Alias collection. Let's just clear what we did before. Okay, we're going to start fresh. So first things first, let's look at our primary colors, because our primary colors are going to really influence the different types of surfaces, texts, so on and so forth that are associated with our different brands. With me so far? I hope so. Okay, so inside our alias collection, let's create a primary grouping and just call it like primary 100. Okay, what we're gonna do, we're gonna connect that back to our red. So this year is going to be our 50. This year is going to be our 100. So red 100, red 200. There we go. Red 300. Red 400. Red 500. Silently is watching me do this, but it's part of the, come on. And to add variables like this, what I'm doing is to duplicate the last one, I press shift and then enter or return, like I'm on a Mac. I also need a new Mac, by the way. So can't wait to spend money on that. 700, 800, 900. Okay, and then like a 950, whatever. Okay, and then a 950. So one thing you're probably wondering is like, Kirk, yeah, this makes sense, but our primary color is different between brands. Like in our, what do you want to call it? Our Coca-Cola, it's red, but in these two, our primary color scale is actually different. Like it's actually the same. Aha, there we go. So now this year is going to be Coca-Cola. Let's just call it classic. Okay, for not classes, classic. There we go. For Coca-Cola, but then we're going to add in another mode. Okay, and then this year is going to be our Coke Zero. Makes sense so far? Perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to connect back into that gray where we have that 100. That's where is it? Our gray. That's so gray 50, gray 100, gray 200, gray 300. Gray 300, gray 400. Come on, gray 400, gray 500, gray 600, 600, gray 700, gray 800, and then the gray. I don't think we did a gray like 875. And then for this one, we can do like a gray black. Okay. So, because again, for our Coke Zero and our Diet Coke, they share relatively the same colors. Now, this is one thing that's important to call out here, is it's best if you have the same number of scales when you're working within the same number of colors in your scale when you're working within a multi-brand design system, but they don't always need to be to match specifically. So 900, 875, this is something I've seen a lot of other creators not necessarily get wrong, but it doesn't always fit every use case, where they say your 800 needs to go with an 800. There can never be a case where your 900 goes to your 875. Like, guys, it's your design system. Okay, do what makes best for you. Okay, let's keep moving on then. Now, next question is, Kirk, our Diet Coke has a different primary color. Okay, their primary color is this, but Coke Zero's is actually this. So that's fine then, is we can just ultimately bring in a different scale. So this here is going to be Diet, or to add a different mode, but because they share the exact same scales, this is really going to be the same. What's going to change is how we actually apply the variables here to the individual components. Important to note. So now all of a sudden, our primary colors, we have different modes for each of the different brands, which connect back into sort of the brand scale in this case. Now, if this was Diet, if Diet was like a blue, we would connect back into the blue. But because Zero and Diet, again, I chose this example for a reason, because it's a little bit more complex. Because they share the same scale, with Zero's core brand color being that black, and with Diet's core brand color being that lighter gray, it just was one of those use cases that I really wanted to cover. Okay, so we have that primary out of the way. Now, what about everything else? Something that confuses a lot of designers when they're going from a one brand design system to a multi-brand design system is when you start working with like neutral colors like this. Because in the case of, again, Coke Zero and Diet Coke in this case, is your scales are predominantly what's going to be used for font, right? Like you're going to pull from ultimately from your Alias collection, then from your gray scale in your brand collection to get your font colors. So what happens with a lot of designers, okay, is I'm just going to create a new group here, just call this like a primary sample example. okay, just so you know, whatever, is what they'll do here is they go like 50, 100. Okay, so let's say in this case, it's we pull from our grays. Again, this is specifically for fonts because this is what trips a lot of designers up. So we'll have our gray, create the alias, our gray 100, gray 200, gray 200, gray 300, gray 400, gray 500. Okay, only do one more here, all the way up to like your gray, 900, whatever it is, or 875 in this case. Okay, is if that's like a primary color, what trips a lot of designers up is when they're actually applying out their like carrying out like they're building out their text variables in the map collection that we're going to look at later, is they pull from the primary. Okay, especially if like their core brand is gray. But what tends to happen then is then if all of a sudden these are a completely different shade, oops, sorry, not the background here that I want to change, is this one, is if their second brand is all of a sudden a completely different shade of color, like a red. Okay, what happens then is then when you swap between brands, all of your paragraph sizes paragraph colors, get changed to red or the other color. So whenever you're building out your variables in your alias collection, you're always going to need a neutral scale, because this is introducing a neutral scale is going to avoid what happens when your primary scale is gray. So then all of a sudden, all your text variables connect back to that gray scale. And then when you add an extra brand, all your paragraphs, all your headings, they all turn into completely different color. Hopefully that makes sense. Any questions, leave comments below or ask on our forum. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to introduce a new color grouping here inside our alias collection for neutral, which is going to be used for our font colors. So in the case of a branded house, what we're going to do is for neutral, just change it to our grays. So it's going to be our gray 100. This is going to be our gray 200. This is going to be our gray 300. This is going to be our gray 400, gray 500, gray 600, gray 700, 700, gray 800, gray 850, 850, and then gray 875. We can change this to 800, 850, sorry, and 875, no call. Okay, whatever works, because now these are all aligned. Or sorry, this should be our gray black. There we go. Okay, so your neutral is defining what those font colors are for all your brands. Okay, if they are different, again, then we're getting into a house of brand strategy and house of brand approach. Okay, then so continuing on, for your house of brands, let's duplicate this, and then let's call this our information. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to change these all to our blue. So blue 100, blue 100. Again, that's something important to note too, is one thing if we are doing this properly again. Ideally, what we'd like to have is like the same number of colors in each scale. But if we don't, if you don't have a blue 50, you can just connect it to the lightest blue color. That's fine. Okay. It's again, I know design systems are not always so, what's it called? Nimble like that. Okay. So blue 400, blue 500, blue 600, blue 700, blue 800, blue 900, and like a blue 900. Okay. And then next, for the magic of video editing, I'm going to do the same for both zero and also diet. Okay, as I said, do the magic of video editing. One thing I did is, again, I just chose the same blue colors for zero and also diet brands, and also brought in our success colors as well. Again, so what I did is I connected our success grouping in alias to our greens in brand, and because they are all sharing a lot of the same colors, it's really only that primary color that is different. Then all are going to share the same shade of green. If we start getting into different shades of greens, we are no longer in a branded house. Okay, so with that out of the way, one thing I want to look at now is error states, because there can be a lot of confusion if you have a primary color that shares the same scale as your error, information, or success. Thing I also did real quick, sorry, I forgot, is I actually also introduced my warning. Okay, I forgot. Sorry, that's on me. Okay, so here I am back on like the Coca-Cola website. And now what's the one thing we noticed with the URL? Okay, is it's not specific to an individual brand. It's just Coca-Cola, right? Now, on the contact form here, what's one thing that we notice is that a couple of our fields here are in like an error state. So basically what this is saying is that although one of our brands has a primary color of red, all of the same, like that red that's associated with the color scale of Coca-Cola Classic can also be used for an error state. So all three brands can pull from the red scale, despite the fact that that red scale connects to one of the brand's primary colors. What you're going to hear a lot of is that that shouldn't be the case, is that primary should always be separate from error. But then what's going to happen is you're going to have like two scales that are exactly the same for what? To duplicate, to separate it out for the purpose of separating it out. That's too complex. We don't need to do that. Okay. So I just wanted to give this as an actual like real life demonstration. So what we can do then, we can just duplicate our primary grouping, call this our error, and then go ahead and just change all these to connect back to the red. Okay. So despite the fact that Coke Classic, its primary color is also the red scale, these here are all going to also share the red. Okay. Now, one thing you're probably wondering is, Kirk, is if we look back at the Coca-Cola air variable or air color for the air message, is a little bit different than sort of our primary red color. And that is completely fine, because one thing we're going to do is when we actually get into our mapped collection, I'll just do this one sort of behind the scenes, is when we actually get into our mapped collection, we're actually going to be able to choose which color from this red scale connects into our icon air, our text air, versus our surface air, versus like our primary color for that Coke Classic. Okay, so we'll be able to differentiate those colors out once we get into the mapped collection. So while we're here, before we move into our mapped collection, one thing I want to cover here, okay, is also our font weight and font styles. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to add a string variable that we're just going to call, not to our foundations collection. Forgive me there, all variables. We're just going to add a string variable, not a number variable. Careful you don't do that. Sometimes I do it and I have to redo it later. Anyways, we're going to call our font style. And then starting off, we're just going to have like you can do it a couple of different ways. You can really just call it like enter, and then just make sure this equals enter. And you can go like roboto, and then this might equal roboto. If you want to, you can also just call this primary and secondary if you want to specify it out even further. But I find that if you call it primary and secondary in font style, then what happens when you get into alias is kind of connecting back to something weird. Anyways, so you can just call it like enter, then also roboto here. Okay, we can also duplicate this for our font weight. And we can have like a regular and a regular here, regular and regular, a medium and also like a medium. One thing that's important to note here is if I just close this here and let me hide my video bar out of the way. If we go like enter, we have enter and we have like roboto. The names need to ultimately match what's here. So this has a medium, this has a regular. So roboto has a medium and also a regular and also a bold. And so does enter as well. So regular, medium, and bold. So therefore, like they kind of equal the same. If they're different, then what you can do is you can have font weight enter, and then font weight roboto. But because they share the exact same naming conventions, we can keep it within one. Okay, regular, medium, bold, and then also bold. And then what we can do is we can then bring these inside of our alias collection. Okay, so then what we can do in our alias here is we can like duplicate or not duplicate a group. Sorry, let's add in another number variable here that we're just going to call our font style, and we can call it like our primary or our heading. So maybe we want to do like, oh, sorry. See, I told you I accidentally added a number variable. It should be a type variable. So to add in that string variable that we're going to call font style, and then let's maybe go with like our heading. Okay. So this is great because it's sort of going to allow us to dictate what fonts are which. Okay. Because even in branded house, it's fine if like a heading is like slightly different than another. Okay, it's not the end of the world. So what we can do is we can connect this back to enter, this back to enter, and then this back to Roboto, and then maybe this here is also like our paragraph. Then we're going to have enter Roboto, and for whatever reason, actually let's just make all these enter. Again, focused on setup for now. You can make them Roboto. You might have a caption, then you might have a placeholder if you really wanted to. But again, when we go ahead and apply these to styles, then as you swap the modes, these are also going to change as well. Okay. So when it comes to your font weight, your font style, that's generally how you can also set it up. So just take the really same logic that we did for the colors and apply it to your font weights and your font styles too. So now let's look at our mapped collections. Let's create a new collection that we're just going to call mapped here. And again, if you're not familiar with your mapped collection, I would go take a look at our build a design system series or design system setup video, where it goes more in depth on building out your mapped collection. The build a design system series is more basic. Our design system setup video is more complex, where it sort of walks through the variables in the collective kit. Okay. Links for those again will be below. So if I zoom out here and try to find our stuff, there we go. Again, so your mapped collection, what it is basically where you have all the specific variables that actually go into or on your components. Okay. So we're not going to build out a full mapped collection, because that's not what you're here for. What you're here for is to learn about multi-brand design system setup strategies. Again, you can go watch others videos to learn how to build the variables for this. Okay. So right away, we're going to need a surface primary and then a default. What this variable is if I have, let me move my video bar out of the way. Let me condense this in. Sorry, there we go. If I have a simple button here, okay, and it's going to be hello. Oh, we're really zoomed out here. So let's set this something like 24. Okay, so we just have a simple button component. I'm going to add a fill, and what the surface default is essentially what the color of your primary buttons are. Okay, again, we get more in depth than this in the design system setup video. So what I do is I'm going to create the alias of this and search for our primary, our 500. Because again, that is the standard color that we used for like our primary Coke brand. That is the primary Coke color that is on their buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that surface default. Okay, let's call this our button. And then let's create the component of this. And again, we're just going to set the text to white for now. Okay, we're not going to worry about the text variable for this moment. Then what we're going to do is let's copy an instance of this. Okay, shrink this in a little bit more. Sorry, I wish I had a bigger monitor. And now let's go ahead and change the brand. So Coke Classic, that works. But then if we set this to Coke Zero, look what happens. This would work for Diet Coke, but if we go back and look for our Coke Zero brand, our colors are more black than anything else. Now for the Diet Coke, we're just going to assume that our surface default is also that gray. Okay. So what's the issue with this? Because now the Coke Zero brand is not following the structure that we are not following the format that we would like it to have. Let's go back to Alias. We are now getting into advanced tokenography at this point. So if I was just to condense these in more, just so we can see it a little bit. So now this 500, what it does is it produces the right color for Classic and the right color for Diet. Again, just assuming that the gray is actually the button gray for Diet. But for Coke Zero, we would actually need this to be that black or that much darker gray. So this is no longer a 500 at this point. What we're going to do is we are going to change this to our default value. So now what we can do is we can make the adjustments for Coke Zero, where if we set this back to something like our gray 875, and we look at our component now, oops, sorry, I changed the wrong one. Forgive me there. Change this one back to our 875. Sorry, there we go. And now you're going to notice that now that color adjusts as planned. So we have our zero, and then we also have our Diet. So again, we change that 500 to the default because this represents the default row for those surface primaries. And now instead of it being following that logical 100 value, by assigning it the name of default, what we can do is we can change the value within the alias scale itself. So now let's do the same with our text variables here. So I'm going to create a new color variable. What we call our text primary on color. And again, our on color variable specific is it's the color that appears for our text when it's on a colored background. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect this back to our neutral, again, in this case, our 50. Okay. So again, our alias, this is going to connect back to our neutral 50 in this case, or if you had a foundations white, you could do that. Okay. So if we think about back to our alias, in this case, our on color is always going to be the same. Okay. So our gray 50, so on and so forth. So we can change this to our text primary on color. And now all the variables across the brand are change on color. Okay. So it's really, really that easy to set that up in your mapped collection. So you could go through and do that for all your surface variables, your text variables, your icon variables, and also your border variables as well. So now one of the questions that I am 110% going to get is Kirk, my neutral 50, my text color needs to be different for diet, slightly darker for diet than it should be for classic. Do I need to call this something different? Because if our 500 is our default in this case, what about if we need to change another value? Really, the only thing that matters is your default color. Everything else can kind of change. Like you can kind of mix and match. You need to remember is that Figma is not built to handle multi-brand design systems. They tried their best given the constraints that they have, but it's not perfect, right? So if you need to have a different color, just leave this as a 50, but then just change this to like a 500. Okay, it's totally fine. You just need to document your decisions why, so designers in the future are going to know. Now, one thing I'd also like to call out is that if it's having a 50 here and a 500 still makes you a little bit uncomfortable, what you can do is you can actually simplify neutral example. You can actually simplify your tokens, where maybe you get rid of some of the ones in between here, maybe delete these, and then it's lightest, lighter, lighter, light, and then default, and then dark, darker, darkest. Okay, that's a more logical approach in terms of the naming, especially if the values within your individual brands are not always consistent. So you might go from like a 50 to like a 500. You can kind of change the name to be a little bit more general instead of stay at that 100 value. So that wraps it up for our branded house approach, more the simplified version. Let's get into it now, where some of the more complex approaches, predominantly our house of brands approach. We're going to talk about some of the logistics there associated with that. So now let's look at house of brands. Okay. Now, one thing that's important to know about house of brands is that Figma as a tool is not built to house design systems in one file that are house of brands. Okay. It's just not built that way. Now, you can do it. And we're going to cover some of those approaches and a lot of the questions that I get associated with house of brands. But in a nutshell, my best advice for whenever you're working with house of brands is break it up into a separate design file. Okay. Again, that is my general recommendation, but there's different things that you need to think about. I don't know every edge case associated with your brand. So in this section, we're going to cover, okay, what is house of brands? What are some different approaches that different designers take to almost make it work within their Figma file, and answer a lot of the questions that I get associated with house of brands as well. Okay. So with that said, let's dive right in. Okay. So now let's look at our house of brands. Okay. So let me move my video bar out of the way again. So when it comes to your house of brands, again, the Coca-Cola company is a really good example, because again, if you look at their website, the brands don't appear all that different, but for this purpose of this exercise, we're going to assume that they are different. Okay. Because the Coca-Cola company has a ton of different brands underneath it. It's not just Coke. They have Sprite, Vitamin Water, Powerade, Fanta. They got a whole bunch of other things too. Now, if we zoom in on Coca-Cola and Sprite, what's one thing that we notice? The colors are different, completely different. And when we looked at the Coke brand, they didn't have any yellow or green in them. So Sprite has its own color set. Also, too, the font is completely different. If these had applications, I bet you the Sprite branding is going to be way different than the Coke branding. Okay, so the brands are not the same. So now it might be more difficult to introduce them or integrate them into the exact same variable set as we did earlier with our branded house approach. Moving on. Also, too, Vitamin Water and Powerade. These are completely different. You know, vitamin water is a vitamin product, but Powerade is an electrolyte product. And of course, the branding is also different. The font is way different. Powerade's font is much more futuristic. The colors are different. Vitamin water has like 25 different colors, where Powerade has like 6. And then still, if we look at these holistically, Sprite is completely different from Powerade, because Sprite is like a sugary drink and Powerade is an electrolyte drink. So if all of these had applications, they would have different purposes. This would be more geared towards athletes. This might be more geared towards kids. This might be more geared towards everyone. And this might also be more geared towards everyone. And each of these have different products within them, because there's Diet Sprite, Sprite Zero, same as Coke as we had before. So this is where you can see that there really is no right approach to this. You kind of need to do an audit of each of your brands in order to identify the best approach as possible. So this is what I mean by house of brands, where if your parent brand has a ton of sub-brands underneath it, because this involves a lot more thinking, a lot more technical logistics in terms of how you might want to go about and set up your design system. So now the generic approach, or like the question I get all the time is, Kirk, I get house of brands. The brands might be different, but can't I just still squeeze them into the same file, still following the same logic? Now, in theory, yes, you can. If every single variable is exactly the same, then in your brand, you're just going to have different groupings for, like, this might be, you put these all in a group. These would be for Coke. You could duplicate all these, then you might have another group called Sprite, right? Where it still has all those core colors. And then your alias, it might get a little bit messy in some points, but really, if every single variable is exactly the same, sure, in theory, you could do it, okay? But a lot of designers think that they can do it, but then they don't necessarily always realize how different all the brands are. Because if I have a surface primary for, you know, Coke, maybe my Sprite also has surface secondary, but my Coke doesn't. Then all of a sudden your Coke is going to have a secondary grouping when it shouldn't have it, because Sprite needed a secondary grouping. And then maybe vitamin water doesn't have a secondary grouping, but Powerade does have a secondary grouping. Same with tertiary as well. Take that same logic. Maybe only vitamin water, because that's so many different like shades here, has a tertiary. So now all of a sudden you're forcing all your other brands to then have a primary, secondary, and a tertiary, when some might only need a primary or a primary secondary, right? So you can see how complex that could get if all of your brands are significantly different. So if you are going to try to squeeze them in, all in the same approach that we saw for branded house, when you have a house of brands, you need to absolutely make sure that the variables, every single one of the variables, whether it's whatever it is, needs to be exactly the same. So the variable structure cannot be an ounce different. So a big part of having a multi-brand design system and choosing an approach is being able to defend your decisions. Now, one scenario I always get asked is, Kirk, can't we just swap out the library? So what this would mean is housing a separate variable library inside a separate Figma file. So for brand A, you would have, again, a mapped collection here. And just to simulate this, I have a surface primary default. And then I have a separate Figma file for brand B with a surface primary default. Because again, we want the naming conventions to always match if we were to ever do that swap. We know how that works for component styles and all that stuff. We want them to be as similar as possible. Okay, with me so far? And what I'm going to do then, so I published both brand A, brand B with me so far. So again, just to summarize, I have a surface primary default in brand B and a surface primary default in brand A. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pull in these as if I was building components, really. So surface primary defaults for brand A, and then copy it, and then for brand B. So again, what essentially I did here, ignore the rogue style that I have floating in there. But so basically what I did here is I published brand A and brand B as a design system, and then subscribed to it in this file. So now I have access to those variables. Now, what a lot of designers will do, or try to do at least. So if I go down to libraries here, and I go into brand A, they try to swap the library. So what that would essentially be doing is you build out the design system using brand A, and then you change it out to brand B. Again, assuming that those variable namings are consistent. But you can't swap variables. You can only swap components or styles. So that approach actually would not work. Now, the other approach that a lot of designers try, I think I've chatted about it in the past too, because it's an option, but like it's not recommended, is to have a new collection for like mapped brand B. Okay. So what we're then going to do then is let's add in like a surface primary surface primary defaults. And again, we'd also then have create a new collection for like an alias B, alias brand B. Again, this is the assumption that they're entirely different, and then create a new collection that's like brand collection, brand B. Okay, whereas all the other ones are brand A. So if we were to reorder these, so this comes up here, this comes up here. Oops, sorry, mapped. Come on, move right. Why is it not working? Come on. There we go. So then we'd have our brand B, alias brand B, mapped brand B. Okay. So this is great in theory, because if I was to create a component of this, just call this a button where it's like hello, oops, and add some auto layout here. Then if we wanted to change, God, what am I hitting all these buttons for? Surface primary defaults. Then if we wanted to change this to a surface default for the other one, we would have to essentially bulk select all the variables and then change the collection. It's a recipe for disaster, because every time you need to change the individual design system, like you would have to basically bulk select every single one of the variables in order to change it. It's a nightmare. Things are going to end up getting missed. So although in theory, though, like I've seen it happen before, and some companies do make use of this structure because brand B is more of like a secondary. Everything is done in brand A. The developers just need to reference brand B variables, which is usually when this approach works. If you actually need to swap between brands, the approach here, not a good call. So another approach that I always like to have, okay, is if, again, we've exhausted all options now, is what I always have is I have a master design system. So I'd actually build out a design system for one brand, and every time, and it would just be the master design system. That's it. I wouldn't touch that file. But then what I would do is I would duplicate it for brand A, and then duplicate it, God, for brand B. Okay, so only once this design system master was at a point where, like the master file was at a point where it had all the necessary components, modules that I need to set the other brands up for success, that's when I would start to duplicate it. Okay, but there are some logistics associated with that approach. Okay, so I can't hammer it down enough. Like, don't start working on brand B until brand A is fine. Okay, otherwise you're gonna be mixing and matching between the two. You're gonna get confused. Just get one brand down straight and then focus on the other brands. Okay, it works regardless of whether you're working for branded house or house of brands approach. So if I, now looping back to house of brands, if I did have that master design system, what I would do is I would group this where I'd have like my foundations. So these would be, sorry, let me add a little item here. So sorry, edit emojis and symbols to add like a star or something, whatever it is. These would be our foundations. So I'd have like our buttons, our duplicate, like our menus, our links. So whatever components like are more standard across the design system. Okay. And then what I would do is I would add a line break and then duplicate this and bring this down. And then this here would be our modules. So what are some of those modules then that might be consistent across or semi-similar between brands? Okay, so maybe you have like an FAQ, which is relatively the same across different brands. You might have like sorry, file upload. That was crazy. I couldn't think of anything. Like a file upload. So what are the ones that are going to be relatively similar between brands? So think of it almost like a skeleton design system that's pretty complete, that's easily then customizable between brand A and brand B, where you could go into, once you duplicate it, adjust the variable styles, adjust the font styles, or the variables like the font styles, like whatever it is that you need within those design systems to make it more in line with that individual brand. Like, I know house of brands is a confusing topic. It is tricky. Now, chances are, if you're working within a house of brands, you do likely have a larger design team. And I know the approaches that I covered, it's a lot to take in, and it's difficult to choose which is which. Do not fault yourself. Figma is not built to handle a house of brands approach. It is built to handle a branded house approach, because that's ultimately why, one of the reasons why, why is this so big now? Sorry, detach that, and then go back to our alias. Like, That's why they introduced modes for a number of reasons to handle if you do have different brands. What Figma wasn't thinking about is what if your brands are entirely different, where they don't follow the same structure? Things need to change between them, where all of a sudden it complicates things too much, building them within the same variable library. Okay. So again, Figma is more meant to handle a branded house, not a house of brands approach. These are some of the options and some of the setup choices that you need to go through if you do have a house of brands or you do have a branded house, but don't fault yourself if you're still getting stuck or you're still confused. Remember, Figma is not built to handle a house of brands, at least within one design system, but it is built to handle a branded house. Now, it's a question I get all the time is if I am working with a house of brands, can't I just build out one design system using just one variable, using one brand, sorry, and then just store the variables for like the brand B in a completely separate file? Because then all the developers need to do is just reference the tokens from brand B, but they're going to have all the components in brand A. In theory, yes, but then how are you going to check for accessibility? How are you going to check to make sure that the components look as intended? How are you going to make sure that the developers are building it right? Right? Those are some of the small things you need to think about, is actually also being able to visualize your components. It's not as easy as just giving the developers a separate variable library and saying, go ahead. They might want visuals, okay? Especially if there are differences between those variable libraries. Everything can't just be translated over. That works better in theory if the variables are the exact same, but again, you still need to be able to test for accessibility and be able to have a visual of those components. Thanks for watching. If you want to check out the most popular video right now, click right there. And if you want to watch a video I highly recommend, click right there. Also, too, be sure to check out UI Collective Academy and all the courses we have on there. That's on our website. The link for that will be down below.